Welcome to Pirate Politics, where we prepare you for your next political conversation. I'm Jeronimo Cortina, political science professor at the University of Houston.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus, also a political science professor here at the University of Houston. Thanks for hanging out with us and talking a little politics. We don't often talk about international politics, but when we do, it's about the Middle East. So there obviously is a tremendous amount of churn happening in the Middle East right now. The most kind of immediate issue that came this week was that there was collapse of the Assad regime in Syria. There are tremendous implications to the balance of power in the region. Presidents for at least a decade, but really for the past, say, 50 years have had to deal with a kind of autocracy happening there. Right. So this is in some sense a good news for the U.S. government. They've been working for this for a long time. But obviously this happening also opens up a tremendous amount of uncertainty, especially at a time where we're seeing a transition from one president who will deal with it one way and potentially a different president who will deal with it a different way. So talk to me about what you think is sort of the implications to this big picture-wise for the transition in the presidential term, but also just kind of what we think might happen for each.
Oh, wow. Well, it's, as you know, there is a conflict between Hamas, between Hezbollah, Israel. Yeah. Now you have...
Sprinkle ISIS in there just for good measure.
And now, boom, let's bring Syria to the fold.
Right.
So it's a very changing situation in which you don't know what's going to happen.
Totally.
Right now, President Biden said now, I guess, ex-rebels, because now they're going to take control of the government, are saying the right things, but we don't know.
Still early.
Yeah.
And one question is sort of why this happened. And it's interesting to see how all the kind of dominoes place and how they fall, because really, in some sense, Israel's claiming credit for this, because it really did occur in part because Israel is sort of in conflict with Iran. And so Syria is sort of sending more resources to Iran to help. Iran doesn't have a military per se. They really engage in proxy warfare. So Syria really was helping prop them up. But because of the way the resources were distributed and because Syria was also sending help to Russia in Ukraine, the kind of basic kind of bubble opened up and gave the rebels in Syria a chance to come in. So in a way, that kind of balance is really important. But the concern really now is about chemical weapons and about the proliferation of nuclear weapons, if that's something that is, of concern. There are also, of course, concerns about terrorism, right? Now, ISIS has been kind of relatively isolated to some of the kind of more outlying regions of Syria. But no matter who is the president, right, Biden or Trump, they still have to think about this in a long-term implication. Trump says basically, okay, it's a mess, like literally quoting, it's a mess, but it's not our mess. So I think that you're going to see a very different kind of tact than you take for Biden, who spent a lot of time the first few days really trying to stabilize things. But at the end of the day, they're both going to have to deal with the same kind of problem, the same conundrum, including possibly a refugee crisis. So do you think that Trump is going to have a kind of difficulty with this in the early days? Does he have a chance to define his presidency early at a moment where he's going to have to fight for nominees and he's going to have a bunch of executive orders, right, like the first few days?
Well, I mean, if he does what he said in Truth social media, he basically said, let it play out. Okay. Do not get involved.
Right.
So it's perhaps a different way to approach the situation. And then it's like...
It's hard for them not to get involved, though, because he said this in 2018, right? But then it was certainly the case that, like, you had to have some involvement, modest involvement.
I mean, the only thing that he missed is until you need to get involved. Because
that's implied, perhaps.
Right. But it's going to be that case when that happens. Yeah. Why? Because you have Israel, during the weekend, Israel bombed strategic positions. Yeah. Obviously, they're worried about what you are saying in terms of proliferation of, chemical weapons, or nuclear weapons or whatnot. And the problem with Syria is quite similar to that when we leave Libya, and is that you have 11,000 billion different factions. And those different factions are looking for the same thing, right? They want to run the show. So that
it seems familiar to
it is very
U.S.
familiar.
domestic ears.
So that could have very important implications in terms of how volatile is going to be the situation in Syria and how these groups are going to get into an agreement, or where see, infighting.
Yeah. Yeah. And obviously, President Biden has got to stabilize the situation before it gets worse. It sounds like that's what's happening, though. Like they were able to execute some strategic bombings to be able to kind of get some of their positions moved. They've been able to get a handle on basically what's happening on the ground. Like things are returning to normal-ish, I guess. It sounds like from reports that basically, people are out on the streets. There's still, garbage being picked up and people are going to schools. Like it's like a kind of normal-ish day for whatever that looks like. So in a way, it's not been the kind of, tragedy or, crisis that could have happened otherwise, which, potentially could still happen. But yeah, so, this is all about shifting sands, right? To the degree to which, you want to partner with somebody who in the past has had terrorist ties, right?
Yeah.
Like these groups are not savory, right? There are some problems. And so there are definitely some issues that they're going to have to work through. But one kind of connection I want to make to stuff we talk about a lot, and that's about the domestic politics of the U.S., is that Tulsi Gabbard, right, is going to be the president's nominee, at least as of this moment, for DNI. And the issue here is, of course, her attachment to the Syrian regime. She's said a lot of things about it. There was a joke from Adam Kissinger, the former member of Congress, who said that maybe that she was going to offer Assad like a sort of sanctuary at her house. It's a joke, but it underscores the fact that she has been discussing this in a way that is controversial and problematic for a lot of people who see this as like her being too close or too wistful about these regimes. Is this going to be a problem for her? Because she's literally making rounds like this week talking to senators trying to get support for her nomination.
I think it's a big problem.
Yeah.
And it's a big problem because she went to Syria in 2017, met with Assad 2 times. She was doing a mission to gather intelligence and to see what's going on the ground. And obviously, as we know now, the Assad family has been hosted by Russia. Wow. Yeah. So the connection between Syria and Russia is very clear. And I guess one of the things that the U.S. Senate doesn't like is if you are going to have at least this indirect tie with Russia. So I think it's going to be problematic because the discussions and the conversations, she has not been extremely open about what happened in those meetings.
Yeah, okay.
And senators are going to be maybe...
some pretty tough questions.
You're going to be in charge of national intelligence.
Yeah.
I don't know.
We said this before, though, and that's that, like, the one strategy from President Trump is to basically flood the zone.
Exactly.
Right? And so this is one of those moments where, like, Pete Hegseth is the first person who's, like, looking at the headlines and, like, whoo, like, no one's talking about me for a while.
Yeah.
But obviously they're going to talk about him again at some point very soon. But there's so much going on that you're likely to see this come up again. So we'll monitor this, obviously, as it goes. It's an ongoing situation. But for sure it has implications to President Trump's kind of ability to get his nominees back into office. But from one desert to another, let's shift gears and talk about Texas.
Okay.
Let's talk about what's happening in Webb County, all the way down in South Texas. The Democratic county judge in Webb, Texas, Judge Tano Tijerina, is switching parties. He's switching to the Republican Party. This is not uncommon because you see a lot of parties switching after elections, especially when you've got a tide turning towards a different party. But this certainly has serious implications from a symbolic point of view, from a PR point of view for Republicans who are crowing about the fact that they can have yet another convert in South Texas. What does it mean?
Well, I mean, it has more caveats, I think, than what the normal. What would you think
what you
about
would otherwise give me?
So
you're always giving me caveats on this. I want to get the straight dope on this.
It is true that President Trump made significant insights in this election in South Texas.
You're often skeptical about this, then.
Absolutely. It's President Trump. Trump. It's not the Republican Party per se. It's not whatever it is. It was what President Trump was saying and the message on the economy. If you look down below, if you open the hood,
yes, okay,
then you're gonna see that voters in Webb County and most of South Texas chose Democrats in down ballot races. Right?
So you're thinking he's overplaying his hand here. But because his argument was like, okay, the Democrats have gone too far. He literally talks about them as being radical.
Correct.
And they've moved to the left too much on these
Correct.
social issues. He also talks about the kind of things that we've talked about a lot in terms of what that transition politically looks like, that they're concerned about oil and gas jobs, they're concerned about immigration.
Absolutely.
Moving to the right or staying to the right on that.
But that was my second caveat.
Yeah, okay, number two. It's almost Christmas. I'm like, I get a second caveat? Wow.
So I think he's right
Yeah.
in terms of how Democrats have approached it. And it's a matter of how state parties, in this case, the Texas Democratic Party and the National Democratic Party, approach these issues. Is it going too far? Well, it depends where you are.
Right.
If you're in Texas, absolutely, 100%. If you're in California, maybe not too far to the left for Californians. So the right balance has to be done by the state Democratic Party. That did not happen.
Yeah.
And in the border we know that border Democrats tend to be more conservative.
Right.
And we have seen it in many office holders.
And they say basically like the party changed. You know, I didn't change.
Exactly.
The values are the same. And he literally says this in the press release. I think that's right, except there's definitely a kind of radical.
Now you have a caveat?
It's a season of giving.
Okay.
I'm giving you
All
a
right.
caveat.
Fair enough.
The caveat is that basically that when you switch parties, there's a kind of radicalization that happens, right? I remember when Ryan Guillen switched parties, right? Same story, right?
Yep.
He's a conservative Democrat, switches parties to become Republican like 2 cycles ago. Immediately upon this happening, he gets a tweet from Donald Trump, none other than Donald Trump, the leader, titular leader of the Republican Party, saying, welcome to the party, you know, finally you're switching.
Sure.
Like, that is instant, like, polarization that is really interesting to see. The same is true for J.M. Lozano, right, who now has become like a real warrior for the right. And we'll talk about the speaker's race in a second, but he literally has filed a complaint with the Attorney General's office saying that another Republican, Dustin Burrows, is raising money illegally because he says he's speaker when he's not. So that's really a kind of radicalization of this. So my kind of way to sort of track this to say you switch parties, which is one thing, right? But it's another thing to say that like now you're fully in, like you're hooked and you're going to do everything Republicans do, which is in some cases very radically different from what Democrats are doing.
And that's my third caveat.
Wow. It's like the night of the 3 caveats, I think.
and that can have very important implications because a minor shift in terms of how this election is going to translate into years can have devastating consequences in terms of how you're going to lose or win an election.
It's a great point. I want to make this case when we talk about the speaker's race and sort of how these Republicans are seeing the lay of the land. But like 2 years is a long time, but we've seen this movie before, right? We know what 2026 is going to look like because it's going to be a midterm, because you're going to have a reaction to the party in office. So I do think perhaps it's the case that this could play badly in that way. So we'll see how this goes. But it is interesting to see this kind of play out. And of course, everyone has their own opinions about what this means.
Right.
There was concern, though. Democrats basically weren't concerned enough about this. They were saying like, well, okay, yeah, you're going to switch parties. Like, that's fine. This happens. But Republicans, of course, are happy about it. So are the Democrats not worried enough about these kinds of transitions? I mean, it's like one person, one official in a county that's not very big, right? But it still has implications in terms of like how you talk about what's happening in that region. Republicans saying, now we control this, right? We're in the driver's seat. It's sort of true, at least from a top-down point of view, but is this another instance of Democrats saying, like, okay, well, so what? Like, we're going to fight it out in other ways, which could work, but you know, means you have to put more resources in places like Houston, like San Antonio, like Dallas, where you're going to get the numbers from there instead of in South Texas, where
absolutely.
You had them.
The problem is that we haven't seen that strategy so far.
Yeah.
How those resources are deployed are very telling where you think that, in this case, the Texas Democratic Party is going.
Right.
And so far, those resources are not being put in the right place at the right time in the amount that they need to be in place.
And that's all that your job is. Like, that's politics. Like, where to put our money and when and for whom. Like, that's it.
That's why they're seeking for a new leader, I assume.
Okay. Understood. Yeah, there
I
you
guess.
go. Maybe they could look under the tree. They'll get something for for the
coal.
They've already got that coal.
Oh,
though.
yeah, that's
They get
true.
a lot of that.
Yeah.
But let's talk about a different party, the other party. Let's talk about the Republican Party.
All right.
One issue that came up this week was that Dan Patrick said that one of his party items is going to be to ban THC. THC is legal for two different reasons. One is that there's a compassionate use program for people who have certain kind of medical ailments. They're allowed to have access to medical marijuana. And then by the Farm Bill, like federally, there is sort of some forms of THC that are legal. There are lots of caveats and lots of science behind this that I don't understand, so I'm not going to get into it. But it is certainly the case that it's at least partially legal. And you don't have to go very far to look around your town to see this happening, right? Vape shops are everywhere.
Right.
There are gas stations. Like, the concern is that it's too prolific. There needs to be some kind of way to track this, to stop it, slow it, regulate it, something. Dan Patrick says, I got it. I'm banning all of it.
Yep.
But he is maybe jumping the gun a bit, because then you had people like Sid Miller, the ag commissioner, come out and say, wait a minute, Republicans don't just ban stuff. We want small government. And, to boot, about 60% of Texans kind of want this to be legal.
Yeah.
So somebody who spent the weekend in Austin, it's more or less legal.
Right.
Not to say that Austin is somehow unique in this use regard, but for sure there's a lot going on. But this is not common. This is not uncommon across the whole state. So I guess the question is, is this a smart strategy from Dan Patrick? Yeah, period. Question mark, I guess.
Caveat number 4. No, I think...
I was a good boy all year
I think that there's two things. The first one is for medical reasons.
Yeah.
And I think that the Texas legislature approved it a couple of sessions ago, and I think they should not mess with it. I'm saying it with 100% full knowledge. For certain medical reasons, THC and those compound medicines are a miracle.
Right.
It's
so
a great
don't
point.
mess with it. I should have noted that, that Texas also basically okayed it as well. So it's federally legal, but the state okayed it as well by Charles Perry, who is the person who's going to be carrying the bill to now ban it. So just ironies abound. But
so I think that that is very serious, because that can have important implications for the health of many people, like epilepsy. And it does wonders to treat epilepsy.
But
the other thing,
Dan Patrick says that's not going to be effective.
Right.
The kind of compassionate use program is not going to be effective.
Right.
This is like your corner vape store is not going to be able to carry this anymore.
So I think that it's going to be complicated.
Yeah.
Because if at the federal level you're trying to, for example, cut down agricultural subsidies, hemp, so on and so forth, it's very, very profitable. Yeah. And if you're not going to help farmers, then you're going to make a hole in your base constituents.
That's a great point.
That's one. The other point is just what you just said, is I don't want, or the government should not be in the business of regulating, businesses or prohibiting or anything like that. If I think Dan Patrick's strategy is that, okay, I'm just going to go 1,000% right now
just
with
all in.
the nuclear option.
Right.
Probably he's thinking, well, that's not my real option.
Yeah.
But then
I see.
Scale it down to something that is amicable. Should I...
some kind of regulation, some kind of financial connection to the state. They can regulate and tax it.
And I think that, yes, these things need to be regulated. Yeah. If you're going to make it, you have to follow the same blueprint as Colorado. And the blueprint of Colorado is very clear. The state has a stake in terms of quality, in terms of where the, hemp or plants or whatever are coming from. What are you using? It's like any other crop that is going to be regulated and that that what you're buying is not going to cause something else. So I would say don't ban it, regulate them, and make them pay a significant tax, especially, finally, my last word on this point, on looking into the future in terms of oil is going to go out one of these days.
Yeah, okay.
Because it's,
no more, what Kinky Friedman call it, dinosaur wine. No more from the ground.
No more from the ground. So you have to start looking for other revenue sources that can also help us when oil goes down. You have another revenue stream.
Well, yeah, and it may just not be that it's gone. It may just be that it's the prices are lower, and that has implications too. Less than it did in the 80s, but certainly problematic.
You never know.
You never know. The other thing to note, I think, is that the pushback that he's gotten, at least on social media, which is not like real life, but the pushback he's gotten has basically said, okay, well, Republicans are becoming like a kind of nannies. Like they're just sort of creating this nanny state where we're going to ban you from using this. We're going to not
Yep.
embrace gambling, which has also revenue implications to the state. We'll talk about that for sure at the beginning of next year. But it's also the case that they're banning social media for minors. We talked about this earlier, but they're banning TikTok, banning access to pornography, or requiring there to be,
Yep.
age verification. There's a lot of kind of oversight here that a lot of Republicans look at and say, well, we don't have to do that. Like, it's going too far. So I think that there's a sense from some Republicans that basically this is a step too far. But I think you're right. As a bargaining chip, it makes a lot of sense for him to say, okay, my plan is to ban it. And then everything else below that seems like a win for people who were against that. So
Exactly. And that's very interesting, because on the one hand, you have the attitude of the state of Texas is like, we don't want the federal government to tell me what to do.
Right.
Okay, fair enough.
But
I
we're
understand.
totally going to tell you what to
Exactly.
do. But we know better, and we're going to tell you
Exactly.
what to do.
And that creates cognitive dissonance, especially on those that think that those, let's say, pure Reagan followers, that President Reagan was very clear. The problem is the government.
Yeah.
So,
or the libertarian streak has really overtaken
Exactly.
a lot of the party, so they don't want to see kind of any unnecessary regulations, and like more of that just creates more problems. Let's talk about the legislative process. Two big things this week. The first is that the Democrats have elected a new caucus chair, and the second is that the Republicans have, let's say, elected, in quotes, I'm air quoting if you're listening and not watching, a Speaker of the House. The first is the Democrats have picked Jean Wu here from Houston as the caucus chair. Trey Martinez-Fisher, who was a known legislative knife fighter, very good at this. The Prince of Pooh, I call him in my textbook. He's the kind of legislative guru. And they picked Jean Wu, who is very outspoken on Twitter, very aggressive on Twitter. So we're definitely going to see a much more bare-knuckled approach to politics on this. If the Democrats were looking to convey a kind of moderate sense, right after the election, there was a concern maybe they went too far and are pushing their kind of initiatives too much. Well, Jean Wu is not the right choice to that, because he is definitely not subtle. For all the things you can say about him, he is not a subtle person, certainly on Twitter. And that may just be a kind of bluff where, like, you want to go kind of hard on one side and sort of, kind of pull it back on another. But for sure, it's the case the Democrats want to shake it up a little, and they don't mind bringing the fight to the Republicans. So what do you make about this?
Well, I think it's Texas politics. I think it's regional Texas politics. So when you're thinking about the border, you have to think about the border and the context that involves the border in terms of politics, ideology, so on and so forth. When you're thinking about the big Texas triangle, Austin, San Antonio, Houston, that's a different story.
Right. Different audience.
Different audience,
Yeah,
yes.
I see what you mean.
In terms of what is going to happen. At, I think, the Texas Ledge, I think that bringing that approach might be something new.
Yeah.
Because right now, in my view, and what we have been seeing in terms of Texas politics is that Democrats are keeping the high ground and this and that, et cetera, while on the other side, especially during elections, you see the Republican Party taken down to street level politics.
Yeah.
So what happens is if Democrats say, okay, fair enough.
Yeah, okay.
We're going to go down and fight it over there.
We're going to war over it. Interesting. Yeah, I think you're right, because you see the transition from caucus chair from Chris Turner, who is a negotiator. He was willing to work with the parties. He'd say what he meant and obviously had his own kind of point of view. But then you transfer to Trey Martinez-Fisher, who's obviously a pugilist in the legislative arena, maybe not so much publicly, and then to Jean Wu, who's very outspoken, very aggressive. So that transition, I think, has become very clear. And so you're seeing how the Democrats have responded to the way Republicans have operated politically. Let's talk about the Republican Civil War. Just as a big, broad note, this is like the most dramatic, most intriguing telenovela you've ever seen. I know you're a fan. I know you watch
100%
every day. This is stunning, right? Like, more twists and turns than a Marvel movie. The plot on this is pretty simple. Basically, they got to pick a speaker. They had two candidates sort of coming into this. David Cook from Mansfield, who said ultimately he has the votes. The caucus met. Dustin Burrows also was running. The caucus ends up kind of disbanding. They break. The caucus splits. The people staying vote for Cook. The people who left are supporting Burrows. Burrows says that he's got the votes because he has partners with the Democrats. Republicans on the Cook side say you can't do that. There are implications to this. Basically, the rules say you have to support the candidate we picked, and this is the candidate we picked. The people on Burrows' team say, well, there wasn't a quorum, so that's not official. And in any case, we're not going to adhere to that. So the implications of this are tremendous. Obviously, who gets to be speaker has tremendous implications to the flow of legislation. What do you think about the politics of this and how it affects kind of what's going to happen in January?
Well, it's going to come down to Democrats and some Republicans that have not shown their cards.
Yeah.
If Burrows claims that he can secure 76 votes of 150, then he got it.
Okay, yeah.
The problem is if Democrats can't trust Burrows, who has brought some type of legislation that hurt places where Democrats are making inroads. That is big cities. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very complicated. But certainly what it is that we're seeing Republican infighting because Representative Cook did not get a whole of, the whole votes.
Yeah, and he pitched to Democrats to say, like, well, come join me. And Democrats were like, no, thanks.
Yeah.
They'd rather go with Burrows, who's the devil that they know.
Yeah.
But Burrows also says that he'll pass universal vouchers. Maybe it's inevitable, and Dems say, okay, doesn't matter. But the Republicans who are in the mix on this are really the most concerned, right? Because they're the ones who are going to back Burrows. The rules basically say they could be censored, and if they're censored, they can't run on a primary ballot, which means they're no longer Republicans and no longer in office. So that's a serious problem. It's a national fight. Donald Trump Jr. tweeted on this. I think that these members are willing to say, like, okay, like, we'll fight it out. We'll take the risk. We're going to back Burrows right now, but come election 2026, things are going to be totally different. Maybe there's a risk we get to keep our seats, but primaries are vicious. So it's going to be an ugly, ugly fight.
It's going to be an ugly, ugly fight, and we're going to find out that next year. For this week, that's it for today. I'm Jeronimo Cortina.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus. The party keeps up next year.